Washington, after he spoke to President Joe Biden by phone Sunday, House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, Republican California, said they have agreed to meet in person Monday afternoon to work toward a deal on lifting the debt ceiling. McCarthy and Biden discussed the debt ceiling in a call Sunday while the president was flying back on Air Force One from the G7 summit in Japan, after negotiations last week between senior White House aides and House Republicans failed to break an impasse. "My discussion with the president I think was productive," McCarthy told NBC News after their call, adding that the president had requested to meet in person Monday and he accepted the offer. "I think we can solve some of these problems," McCarthy said. "But I've been very clear to him from the very beginning, we have to spend less money than we spent last year." McCarthy said both sides are still apart, but he and the president had decided during their call to get their negotiators back together. "Let them brief up the president, let him get some sleep. And he wanted to get together personally tomorrow. I agreed to that, we'd do that sometime in the afternoon," he said. "Time is of the essence." A White House official confirmed the upcoming Monday meeting at the White House between Biden and McCarthy and said that their staffs will also reconvene at 6 p.m. Sunday evening to discuss remaining issues. McCarthy praised White House negotiators for engaging in very professional discussions. "I have great respect for the individuals on the president's team," he said. "They're bright, they're articulate, they know exactly what they're doing. We may philosophically disagree, but we have respect for one another, because we're coming from a place of principles. And when you come from a place of principles, normally at the end of the day, you can find common ground and keep your principles at the same time." The call between Biden and McCarthy came shortly after Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said on NBC News Meet the Press that early June is a hard deadline for the federal government to raise the debt ceiling and warned that bills will go unpaid if Congress fails to reach a deal before the U.S. runs out of money. "I indicated in my last letter to Congress that we expect to be unable to pay all of our bills in early June and possibly as soon as June 1st. And I will continue to update Congress, but I certainly haven't changed my assessment," Yellen said. "So I think that that's a hard deadline." During a press conference in Japan on Sunday, the president urged Republicans to move from their extreme positions, which he criticized as frankly unacceptable, in his opening remarks. "It's time for Republicans to accept that there is no bipartisan deal to be made solely on their partisan terms," he said. "They have to move as well." Republicans returned to the debt ceiling negotiating table Friday night after temporarily putting a hold on talks with the White House, which they said were not productive. Part of the hang-up in negotiations is that House Republicans want to force major spending cuts that are opposed by Biden and dead on arrival in the Democratic-controlled Senate. Democrats are reluctant to accept a spending limit that's lower than current levels, a source familiar with the party's stance told NBC News last week. The party may prefer to maintain existing levels, even if it means a new spending deal fails and the government runs on autopilot through a continuing resolution. Representative Garrett Graves, Republican Louisiana, who was tapped by McCarthy to lead negotiations with the White House, told reporters Sunday that a lot of progress has been made in discussions on the debt ceiling. "If you go through the laundry list of about 50 items, we have made a lot of progress," Graves said. "Understanding one another's positions, understanding red lines. And so I think that we have really been able to come close, much closer than we were when we started." This article was originally published on NBCnews.com. President Joe Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy will meet on Monday to directly negotiate on how to raise the federal government's debt ceiling in the final days before the country defaults on its bills. McCarthy, Republican California, told reporters on Sunday that a conversation he just had with Biden as the president flew back from an international summit in Hiroshima, Japan, was productive and that "I think we can solve some of these problems if he understands what we're looking at. But look, there's no agreement. We're still apart," he said. He declined to provide specifics on how long the debt limit would be raised under a deal and said negotiations are ongoing about the length of any budget caps. Those comments mark a tone shift after an earlier war of words between McCarthy and Biden on Sunday, the latest twist in the roller coaster negotiations to raise the current $31.4 trillion debt limit before the country runs out of funds to pay all of its existing obligations, which will happen as soon as June 1, according to Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. Such a default would be unprecedented and almost certainly roil the U.S. and international markets, risking major financial damage. In exchange for hiking the nation's borrowing limit, House Republicans are seeking spending cuts and policy changes, particularly around aid programs and government permits. Biden has signaled some openness while also calling for tax increases. Office of Management and Budget Director Shalonda Young and White House advisor Steve Ricchetti are expected to come to Capitol Hill later Sunday to meet with Republican Representatives Garrett Graves and Patrick McHenry to ensure Biden and McCarthy are prepared in advance of Monday's meeting. More key sticking points, possible areas of compromise in the debt ceiling showdown. Last week, the White House and Republicans spoke optimistically about reaching a debt and budget deal. But both the president and speaker earlier Sunday publicly rebuked the other for placing partisanship over the economy. Talking with reporters in Hiroshima, Japan, before he spoke with McCarthy, Biden emphasized that the only deal to be made was through bipartisan negotiations. Biden hammered Republicans over what he called their extreme positions on raising the debt ceiling, which was reached in January. It's time for the other side to move from their extreme positions, because much of what they've proposed is quite frankly unacceptable, Biden said. It's time for Republicans to accept that there is no bipartisan deal to be made solely on their partisan terms. They have to move as well. I'm not going to agree to a deal that protects, for example, a $30 billion tax break for the oil industry, which made $200 billion last year. They don't need an incentive of another $30 billion, while putting health care of 21 million Americans at risk by going after Medicaid, he said. The president said that it has been hard to determine where they, Republicans, are, quite frankly, but that working with McCarthy directly could be fruitful. Biden initially resisted negotiating on raising the debt limit, saying lawmakers must hike it without preconditions, but has since agreed to budget talks alongside a debt increase. McCarthy said earlier this weekend that the debt talks would be paused until after Biden returned from overseas, contending that the White House moved backwards during bargaining. My guess is he's going to want to deal directly with me, Biden said in Japan. We're going to have to sit down. I'm hoping that Speaker McCarthy is just waiting to negotiate with me when I get home, which has been I don't know whether that's true or not, we'll find out. It will take several days to turn any legislative deal into law, including moving the bill through Congress and to Biden's desk. However, McCarthy indicated on Sunday that the timeline remains workable for a compromise. Meanwhile, the clock is ticking down to avoid a default, which would likely upend both U.S. and international markets. During his press conference Sunday, Biden still expressed confidence that we can reach an agreement, although minutes later, he said, I can't guarantee that they, GOP, wouldn't force a default by doing something outrageous. Pressed about the possibility of default while appearing Sunday on ABC's This Week, House Budget Committee Chair Jody Arrington insisted that Republicans had done their part by passing a bill last month to raise the debt ceiling, cut spending, and reverse key Biden policies, a bill that was quickly rejected by Democrats. The question is, will President Biden listen to Janet Yellen, his own secretary? And with the window closing on the X-date, the default date, then respond? We've done our job, Arrington said. We've got to right-size and rein in this bureaucratic bloat while addressing the spending problem that's driving the inflation crisis and some of the economic woes that we're experiencing, he said. The president in Japan singled out an impasse over revenue growth, arguing that Republicans are opposed to his proposals to raise some taxes. He said he is willing to cut spending, as well as raise revenue, so people start paying their fair share, but that revenues are where negotiators continue to have significant disagreement. McCarthy shot back Sunday, insisting that Biden previously acknowledged raising taxes would not be part of any agreement on the debt limit. But the president has really shifted right after the more progressive socialist wing of the party stood up and says they want to spend more money. He's now bringing something to the table that everyone said was off the table. It seems as though he wants to default more than he wants to deal, McCarthy said on Fox Business. Biden commented Sunday on the possibility of unilateral action, saying he had considered invoking the 14th Amendment, which states that the public debt shall not be questioned. However, he said that leaning on the amendment to get around the debt ceiling would likely cause a court challenge and a subsequent appeal, a delay that would push the country toward default anyway. I think we have the authority, Biden said. Question is, could it be done and invoked in time that it would not be appealed and, as a consequence, pass the date in question, and still default on debt? That's a question that I think is unresolved. More, Democrats should get ready for Plan B on debt ceiling and force House vote, Van Hollen. The debt ceiling debate has played out during Biden's trip to Hiroshima to meet with leaders from the G7 and allied countries, making headlines even while the president grapples with issues like sending F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine and relations with China. The U.S. and other nations broke long-standing vows to not send the planes to Ukraine when they announced this weekend they would start training Ukrainian pilots on the jets and ultimately send some to Kyiv. Western countries had previously been wary of such a move over fears of antagonizing Russia and potentially broadening the conflict in Ukraine. I have a flat assurance from Zelensky that they will not use it to go on and move into Russian geographic territory. But wherever Russian troops are within Ukraine in the area, they would be able to do that, Biden said Sunday, referencing Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. On China, he added that he expected relations between Washington and Beijing to thaw very shortly, months after the U.S. shot down what intelligence agencies have said was a Chinese spy balloon, an incident Biden called silly on Sunday. ABC News' Justin Gomez and Lauren Peller contributed to this report. President Joe Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy are blaming each other for the current partisan impasse as the clock ticks down to the deadline to raise the United States debt limit and avert an economic crisis. The Democratic president and Republican speaker had a call on Sunday while Biden was returning to the U.S. from the G7 summit in Japan, according to McCarthy, who also said on Twitter that they will meet on Monday to resume talks in person. The open dialogue between the leaders is a positive turn from a day earlier when McCarthy said negotiations were moving backward. The White House and the Republican-led House of Representatives have been locked in a stalemate for weeks over negotiations to raise the U.S. debt ceiling. Biden is seeking an increase in the amount of debt the U.S. is allowed to carry to fund his party's preferred programs as well as military spending, which includes aid to Ukraine. McCarthy wants to see broad spending cuts across the government in an effort to reduce the national deficit. If Democrats and Republicans fail to reach a deal by the June 1 deadline, it could result in the U.S. defaulting on its estimated $31.4 trillion debt, meaning the government will not have the ability to borrow more money to pay bills. It would be the first time in U.S. history that the county defaulted on its debt, which would have dire consequences for the national and global economy. While Republicans are calling for an increase in military spending, veterans care and border security, they're demanding steep cuts to other programs. Biden said that the GOP bill to avoid a default would result in 21 million people losing Medicaid in addition to cutting 100,000 teachers and 30,000 law enforcement officers. Newsweek reached out via email to representatives for Biden and McCarthy. After his Sunday call with Biden, McCarthy told reporters there was no deal, saying they're still apart on reaching an agreement. However, the Republican sounded more hopeful than he did following talks on Friday and Saturday. What I'm looking at are where our differences are and how could we solve those, and I felt that part was productive, he told reporters while leaving the Capitol on Sunday. McCarthy also posted about his call with the president to his Twitter account on Sunday afternoon. Just got off the phone with the president while he's out of the country, the California Republican said. My position has not changed. Washington cannot continue to spend money we do not have at the expense of children and grandchildren. Tomorrow, he and I will meet in person to continue negotiations. Later on Sunday, McCarthy assailed Biden on Twitter, where the speaker shared a video clip of him questioning what it would take for the president to identify places the government is wasting money, saying every household does that, and we should do it too. I literally asked the president, "What is the number?" McCarthy said. "How much debt must America have before you say, let's stop borrowing from China?" Earlier on Sunday, Biden used his press conference at the G7 to slam Republicans over their extreme positions as lawmakers work to hammer out a deal. Now it's time for the other side to move from their extreme positions. Much of what they've already proposed is simply, quite frankly, unacceptable, Biden told reporters. And so, let me be clear. I'm not going to agree to a deal, for example, that $30 billion tax break for the oil industry, which made $200 billion last year. They don't need an incentive of another $30 billion. He also wouldn't sign off on a deal that protects wealthy tax cheats and crypto traders while putting food assistance at risk for nearly 1 million Americans, Biden said, adding that Republicans need to accept there is no bipartisan deal to be made based solely on their partisan terms. When asked if anyone would blame him for the default, Biden said the GOP can use the catastrophe a default would cause to diminish his chances of winning re-election in 2024. "I think there are some MAGA Republicans in the House who know the damage it would do to the economy, and because I'm president, and the president is responsible for everything, Biden will take the blame, and that's the only way to ensure that Biden is not re-elected." Biden also lashed out at GOP lawmakers on social media, echoing his calls for conservatives to back off their extreme ideas in a Sunday evening Twitter post. "So much of what congressional Republicans have proposed during budget negotiations is simply unacceptable," Biden said on Twitter. "It's time for them to move off their extreme position and act to avoid default." However, despite both parties being locked in a standoff, Biden said all 4 congressional leaders agree with him that default is not an option. "America has never defaulted on our debt, and it never will," Biden said. Related articles frustrating debt ceiling talks take another turn. Senators call on Biden to tax the rich and deal to avoid U.S. debt default. Biden okays F-16s for Zelensky, then flies home to face debt ceiling crisis. Start your unlimited Newsweek trial.